So I want to talk about Kaddish and also about this particular quality of Yizkor that I think is so brilliant and that I think I don't know, I just can't imagine why somebody else didn't think of this. Because each day in which we do Yizkor gives us a different window on what grief is all about. It exposes us to one of the different tasks of grief. And so when we accompany our congregants through the year, through the window of Yizkor, we give them the language they need to meet the person that they've lost in a different way each time that we do Yizkor. We also tell them that each of the seasons of Yizkor, Alan talked about the seasons of Musar, but here we are with the seasons of Yizkor. Each season of Yizkor is finite. So when we look at things through the window of Yom Kippur, which may be terrifying, or we look at the things through the window of Shavuot, which is anything but terrifying, we know that we're going to move on and that things will change. When David conceived of the temple, he wrote a psalm, and in the psalm he talks about turning mourning into dancing. So, the immediate image that we get when we hear that phrase, and we hear it in English, is that I go from being, contracted and miserable to being able to rejoice. That's not what the psalm says. In Hebrew, there are 11 different words for dancing, all of which come into English as dance. And so when David spoke about mourning into dancing, he was describing a word that had to do with a ritual, a circle dance, done by people who were in the process of transformation. It was the word for dance used at the Red Sea. It's also the word for dance that's used in the vision of the world to come. And it also has the same root as a word that means writhing, as one does when one is a woman giving birth. So it's a word that means transformation. So his vision of the temple was that it would be a place where people would come in mourning and would learn the dance of transformation. That the temple was a place for transformation.
What is the word?
Mahal.
Oh.
Which, interestingly enough, has the same... Pardon me?
The musician who's married to Michal, who yells at him for dancing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Who is? Wait, who yells at who?
David's wife, Michal.
Oh, right,
yells
that's
at him
true.
for dancing.
Huh, that's interesting. I'm not sure it's spelled. I don't think it's spelled the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a patch of the
But as is always told to me about my great insights, that's a good midrash. Psalm 30, and it also has a connection to the word machala, which is illness. So it's sort of like a homeopathy of healing. So let me just tell you who came on the mourner's path to the temple. It wasn't just people we think of as mourners, as you probably know. It was people who were mourners, people who had lost a significant object, people who who were excommunicants, and people who had someone sick at home. So in the sense of what we have, our world today, it's people who are mourners, people dealing with illness, people whose financial status has changed, people whose role in the community has changed. In other words,
People in transition.
yeah, which is usually, yeah. So it's interesting because when they talk about they don't mention bringing a korban to the temple for these people. But my sense is that they bring what is bakir bi, which is the same root. It's the thing that's inside of them. So they bring their wound, their inner wound, to the temple for the healing. And the healing comes in the blessing, I think, of the community. But let me go to Yizkor, which is the day which is parallels days that people came to the temple. So Yom Kippur is about finishing unfinished business with people. We'll basically walk you through 3 years of Yizkor, more quickly each time. So on Yom Kippur, what do? You go and I say, Aviva, if I've hurt you in any way, let's make it right. And so here's the opportunity to really look at the relationship. However, it's not just Yom Kippur, it's Yom HaKippurim. So it's not just what I've done with the person who's gone that I have to apologize for or make right, but it's also what they might have done that needs healing, that needs atonement. And so that's Yom Kippur, and we'll get back to it. Then the next day on which Yizkor is said is everybody's favorite holiday, Shemini Atzeret. And what's the most important thing that happens on Shemini Atzeret? What's the most significant thing liturgically that happens on Shemini Atzeret? Yeah, you change the blessing from Tal to Geshem. And inevitably, it rains on that day. It does. It's amazing. But anyway, so of course, what is the metaphor for rain in the life of a mourner? Tears, yeah. So then you walk down the path of the calendar and you come into the next day of Yizkor, which is Pesach. And so on Pesach, we're dealing with issues of freedom. And so how am I still living in Pharaoh's house? How am I still lost in the bondage of my grief or trying to fulfill myself in terms of what that relationship was about? How am I still stuck in that relationship, even if it wasn't the most, Camus said, no matter how wonderful a relationship is, it clouds a piece of the sky. And so is that piece of the sky still obscured as I continue in my grief? So it's more of a personal assessment. And then finally, the last day of Shavuot the last day of Yizkor is Shavuot, and Shavuot, of course, is the giving of the Torah. So what was the Torah of the relationship? What was the gift of the relationship? So every year, we have the opportunity to meet the person that we've lost through these 4 lenses. And some people are stuck in the unfinished business, the striving, the fighting, the Yisrael quality of Yom Kippur. And some people can only be in the Hodaot quality of the Judah quality of Shavuot. But knowing that each year you dip yourself in these different aspects of grief allows the relationship to develop, to become more nuanced, to become more whole. It allows the healing to become deeper and deeper as we assess ourselves. Where are we in this part of the conversation? So you understand? You're with me? Okay, so the first thing that we do, let's look at our handouts now. What is the first thing that we do on Yom Kippur? The first sound that we hear.
Kol Nidre.
Pardon me?
Kol Nidre.
Kol Nidre. So what is a vow in terms of mourning? I think that inevitably people will say, and I know people who work as chaplains really know this, if only I had called a different doctor, if only I had been a better daughter, if only I hadn't left the room at that moment. That one you hear a lot. And so these things are just, what Buddhists would call word forms, thought forms, but they take on a reality, these if-onlys. And people they make grand castles of their if-only, and they move into, just take one of each. And they move into these castles, and they become something that they elaborate and they add extra rooms, and so they get really stuck in believing this thing that really is only a thought, and they don't know the answer really, but they live in that regret and in that feeling like they should have done something differently, when we really don't know what it would have been. So allowing people to come to terms, or to just look at what it is they believe about what they might have done differently, how they had turned it in from just a passing thought into a commitment, a vow, and to say, okay, you can let go of it now. You don't have to live there. You don't have to live there. Can you all relate to that? Is that clear? So then the other is really the unfinished business, and giving people permission. I'll talk a little bit later about how the Kaddish is so many things, but one of the most important things, I think, is that it's an opportunity to get said all the things that can't be said, that weren't said before somebody died, and in many cases can't be said before somebody died. There's a tradition that says that when a soul is released from the body, two angels come, and one stands on one edge of the universe and the other stands on the other edge of the universe. And then they have like cross sticks, and so they put the soul in the lacrosse stick, and then they throw it back and forth from one end of the universe to the other end of the universe. And when they do that, all the dust falls off. So what is that dust? New? All that dust is all the stuff that we accumulate over the course of the lifetime that sticks to the soul. In some ways it's the tumor that never gets really released. And so that when I look at Karen, I don't see Karen. I see, memories of rabbinical school, so I see her through this dust. And I can't really see, oh, look at that exquisite soul. Let me greet her with my exquisite soul, because the dust is in the way. So when the soul gets thrown from one edge of the universe to the other, the dust falls away. And so the father, who could never say, I love you, loses that contraction that kept him from saying, I love you. And so sometimes I say to people, they're easier once they're gone, because they don't have all those spiritual adhesions that are the result of a life's history. And so the things that you might not have been able to say, the things that they might not have been able to hear, you can say them now. Yes?
Can you speak perhaps a little bit more? I'm sort of caught on the phrase that you use here of autumn of holding on.
What, pardon me?
The phrase of autumn, holding on.
Uh-huh.
But yet the work that we talk about on Kol Nidre is of releasing.
Uh-huh.
And releasing the what ifs, and releasing the immediacy of the unsettledness. And I know that sometimes this really almost has to do with in what season our loved one dies. It really does seem to start in the fall.
Well, that's that's where we enter.
Yeah. Right. So I understand that piece. So if we're starting at that point of dealing with the things that we need to let go of,
mm-hmm.
the what ifs, the unsettledness of how a person has died, and the incompleteness
mm-hmm.
of relationship, How do I reconcile Shuvah is redeeming and releasing versus the phrase here of autumn is holding on?
Well, I'm not saying that holding on is what we're yearning for, but that's, I can remember when my father died, and I have a tree that is in my backyard, and my office looks out on that tree, and I just, at the time, there was no place where I could be counted in a minyan. And so I made that tree my Kaddish partner. And so I would watch the tree over the course of the year and project wherever I was in my grieving process. I should have brought you all that piece that I wrote about that. And when it got, and so then when we entered autumn and the leaves began to fall, there was just this terrible, terrible sense of vulnerability that I had. Because I didn't want those leaves to fall, just like I didn't want to let go of my dad. And I can remember a point when there were only two leaves basically left on the tree and staying up all night, kind of holding on. So all of this is about enabling us to surrender to the flow of time. And to find tools that'll enable us. So I wasn't meaning to suggest that holding on was the goal. I mean, in the case of autumn, it's really the challenge that we're facing.
So I almost wonder why you don't say, like autumn, why is that not the time of letting go? Just as, because you're using this imagery of nature, and it is the time of letting go and release and returning.
I don't know. I didn't think of it.
I was starting to kind of reconcile some of the releasing and the holding on. I know you didn't mean like holding on forever, but sometimes it is about what do we hold on, what do we savor and retain. Because
we're going to get there.
Everything
but we're going to get there. We're going to let the year take us there. So in autumn, we're looking at the stuff that we're still holding on to. We're looking at the unfinished business. We're looking at the way in which we wish we had done it better, or we wish they had done it better. And so we must.
So looking at what we're holding on to.
Yeah. So yeah. So then, all of the different tools that we have with regard to teshuvah. Maybe there are things we really should have done differently. And so we have the opportunity to really acknowledge them and find a way of rectifying them in the world, whether in the case of someone whose father had been abusive, somebody might decide to, be a better parent, or perhaps volunteer, to be a big brother or something like that. If one feels that they need to do teshuvah in their own soul, they can find an opportunity to come up with something that will be a tikkun, that will be a healing for them in terms of their own growth. So, but then time passes. You don't complete it in one cycle, And so, but we move on, and then we come to this place on Shemini Atzeret, where, there are some things, one of the things we just got finished with Tisha B'Av, and on Tisha B'Av you sit on the ground and you just mourn. It's done. There's no way of bringing it back. You have to mourn. And there are some things that you just have to cry about. And the importance of those, I usually have a box of tissues with me, and somehow I didn't bring it today, and I always hold it up and I say, what is it? Anybody who's been in my classes might remember. And people will look at me like I'm a fool, which I may be, but I say this is not a tissue box. This is a lacrimonium. This is a holy place for catching tears. And I first read about that in in a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a little girl who cried a lot and had reason to cry, and throughout her life she did. And her cousin or her Uncle Teddy went to Egypt and brought her back a little bottle that was an artifact for catching tears. And I thought, how brilliant, how incredible a recognition that tears are holy. And then I joined Temple Israel of Hollywood, and I walk into the lobby, and there are these little Roman glass bottles, and it says on the tag, these are from about the year 100, and they were used by people who were mourning. Well, I've told this story so many times, and I have goosebumps again. They were used by people who were mourning the temple. And so they would catch their tears, and the belief was that when the bottles were full, Mashiach would come. So I point out that there's a very heavy, high evaporation rate in that part of the world. but the recognition that tears are holy and necessary. You know, there's so much that's been written about the kinds of hormones and chemicals that are released when you cry. And so that's from a chemical perspective, tears are necessary. But it's also necessary to recognize that there are some things that just can't be changed, and that we need to just sit with those and feel really sad. And so we're there, but we're there in a really interesting day because Sukkot has just ended the day before. And Sukkot, to me, the primary teaching of Sukkot is that we live in fragile huts, but it is Zman Simchatenu. You know, our lives are vulnerable. Be happy. We are on this very shaky path, which is life, always changing. It's Zman Simchatenu. So that incredible paradox, which to me is the ultimate teaching of the spiritual life, is that, so that comes the day before that we set aside for tears. And then the day after, we're up and we're dancing with the Torah again. So things keep changing, and that is the message of that season. So season, by the way, apparently, I read this, there were 4 pilgrimage festivals in days gone by. But the roads were not navigable. So they sort of conflated it. So people couldn't really get there in the winter, so they didn't have a winter pilgrimage festival. This is also the other.
The Mel Brooks version.
The Mel Brooks.
Exactly.
Another thing about Shemini Atzeret is that the legend is that everybody, Jews, non-Jews, everybody from the ancient world would come because Sukkot in the temple was such an amazing time. They said anybody who hasn't taken part in the water pouring ceremony in the temple, it's like you haven't lived. So everybody would come, not just the people. And so then they would go home, and God would say, as people were leaving, He would say to the family, "Don't go, please don't go." So they would stay another day, and they would celebrate this day. And certainly that is the feeling that one has during. Of course, that's such a big part of grief. Don't do this. Don't. Come back. Please come back. So that's embedded in that as well. So then, the next day of Yizkor is Pesach. And I talked a little bit about all of the different issues, but there's just so many wonderful metaphors in Passover that allow us to look at what it means to move into something new. Certainly the sense of rebirth that is part of the Spring Festival. The emotions that we might have had, positive or negative, We may be tied to something fulfilling and we don't want to let go of it. We may have unresolved issues. So the question is, how are you in bondage to the past or living in someone else's kingdom? And I have all of these things, which I don't know time-wise how we're doing.
We've got about 10 minutes. So
Okay. All right, so each of these, I'm going to let you read these on your own, unless you can, let me cover everything I want, and then, because I think these are pretty obvious, but it just takes the different metaphors, the different symbols of Pesach, and turns them into metaphors for looking at grief. And so then I say Pesach commemorates the Exodus from Egypt and gives us the opportunity to release our bondage to the past. Spring holds the promise of rebirth and the hope that new life will soon begin. So each of these, when I was talking about mourning into dancing, what I wanted to say is that this is our goal with grief. Because the first stage of grief, and people can really get stuck here, is this contraction. This sense that you can't move and you're paralyzed. So anything that we can do to give people a language for the dance, just a way of dealing with it creatively, is an opportunity to get things moving. Because when things move, they change. People say time heals all wounds. It's not true. If time is used with the invitation that it provides, then it can be healing. But there's a real danger of staying in the contraction and feeling hopeless. People come to me and they say, there's no way that I can get over this, and this is just so horrible. And when you hear the story, you can certainly understand why they might feel that way. But I respond with this. I say, you may be right. So immediately, they're like, what? This isn't what she was. And then I say, because but there may be something you don't know. There may be something you don't know, and if there's a possibility that perhaps there's something you don't know, I'm trying to open up a space so that they might be at least curious that something can come in and make a difference. And so that's the incorporating movement, incorporating dance, incorporating curiosity in order to give people something that they can think about. Because that first stage, and it's totally understandable, is that sense of contraction. And what you want to do is to enable someone to at least breathe and to at least move a little bit. And sometimes you have to kind of shock them. When I say you may be right, that usually shocks them. But it also tells them that I understand. There was a woman who came to me. She had lost her toddler to cancer. Horrible, horrible. And but I saw who she was. I saw her life, and I knew that she would get better and that she would incorporate it, that she would go on to have more children, that she would be fine. I didn't say that. I was just with her. And she lived in another city, so I didn't see her very much. I saw her a little bit. And then a number of years later, she gave me a call, and she said, I just came out of a dance class, and I just had this sense that, yes, Benjamin died, but everything's okay. And so I took a breath, and then I said, I always expected this call, but what would have happened if I had told you in the beginning? And she said, I never would have come back to see you. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you have to hold this vision of spring in your own heart and be with them in whatever season that they are. But we still have one more season, which is the summer season, the harvest season. So it's an opportunity, Shavuot, for really naming what were the gifts. I have it outlined. So each of these just breaks it down a little bit, creates something a little bit more nuanced, which will help people with the conversation. But essentially, what are the gifts? What is the Torah? What have you learned? What did you learn from the person who died? What did you learn from grieving the person who died? And finally, what would you like to do to commemorate? I said the name of our people on Yom Kippur might be Yisrael. This one would be Yehuda, the one that gives praise. What memorial act would you perform to commemorate what is past? So then, we're back at Yom Kippur. And the message is that, here's a great story. My mother died a long time ago, 40 years ago, really a long time ago. And she killed herself. And we had a very difficult relationship before. And, I can tell you, it didn't get much better from that. So, I struggled with it. I had a lot of therapy. I did all kinds of things. And one day, my husband, my former husband, said to me, I was mentioning my mother, and he said, this is like 25 years after she died. He said, she hasn't been so bad lately. And it wasn't because she was dead. It was because I had done all the work that I did to continue the conversation, and what was salient, were really her amazing gifts to me. So there I was in kind of a Shavuot place, and I told the story many times, and then it began to sound like shtick to me, and so I had to look at that, and my daughter was in adolescence, and it was challenging. And so a lot of unfinished stuff that I thought had been all put to rest, was bubbling up again. And so I had more work to do. And so the good news, the bad news is that, I thought I was over that. But the good news is that the relationship continues. There's still more to learn. There's still more growing to do. And so the conversation continues, and I find that so encouraging, because it really, the hardest thing that people have to do in life is to exchange the physical connection and the being able to hold them and smell them and hear them and all of that, to the spiritual connection. But once that transition is made, you know that you really haven't lost them. You know that the relationship, you go kicking and screaming because, you want, how many people wear the bathrobes of people they've lost, just so they can have a sense of their physical. Yeah, Lisa, another question?
Yes, I'm actually just thinking, and this is terrific. I'm thinking about the fact that you've said Yizkor and the cycle of seasons, and I know I'm coming from the perspective of being a congregational rabbi. So I look at everything you've written here and I think, this is wonderful. Why, how is this different than, or why is this different than helping people walk through mourning using the cycle of the years and the pieces that are here? When I say Yizkor, I'm thinking of a service in particular. So, I think about the times I've led Yizkor services, and I don't know how meaningful they are to people. We open up a prayer book, we read some lovely prayers, some nice readings, we give them some quiet time, we read a list of names, sometimes we ask people to share some words about their loved ones, but I think of Yizkor specifically as a service. And this is a process of working through. So I don't know whether entitling it Yizkor, and whether you were thinking Yizkor in terms of, you know, that service, that moment.
Well, I think that
or whether the time, you know, using the framework of Yizkor as a way of working with people.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I mean, I'm focusing on Yizkor, which really begins the year after you've left the mourner's path. You know, I mean, I could certainly talk about, and I will talk about the Kaddish in general in terms of its what the opportunities it provides for healing and for continuing the conversation. But I think that Yizkor, I think that I mean, I just think it's so brilliant to understand Yizkor as an opportunity to continue the conversation. And I think that we have gotten, I mean, it just happens naturally with ritual, is that unless it's renewed, unless, you know, we do it mindfully, you know, it can get to be rote. And I think that one of the easiest ones to get rote about is Yizkor, because it deals with such difficult emotions. So opening up Yizkor for as a tool that we have to continue the conversation, and then going deeper into this really remarkable gift that we have by linking it to the different seasons, which, I mean, the holidays just are the days of observance on which it occurs, absolutely cohere with the stages of grief.
I mean, I look at what you've written and I go, gosh, Anne, I want you to write new Yizkor services. I mean, you know, this is perfect. Let's write something that can feel meaningful and fresh and move people.
Well, I mean, I have, you know, I mean, you know, it's a short drash that you do, you know, during a Yizkor service, but to point out, and especially to point out that things change if you do the work. That's really important. So maybe I'll go back to the Kaddish.
Except for Yom Kippur, for most of us, Yizkor is so sparsely attended.
Right.
To be able to give people time to work on this in their own way
Yeah.
within that service. Use some of your ideas and give them a worksheet or a meditation or whatever else you want to call it.
Or I mean, do a Yizkor workshop.
Right.
I'm available to do.
It's a really important piece is that, you know, what I've seen in the last 5-10 years is the whole idea of the generation that would have attended Yizkor is now gone.
Uh-huh.
The next generation has no concept, no connection to, and it's, I don't know whether other congregations or Reform congregations wrestle with this. So I think in some communities, and maybe in LA too, the idea of congregations coming together to do Yizkor, because that's what we need to do to even get a minyan.
Yeah, we do that. We do that in LA.
A critical changing point.
Yeah.
In our communal life.
But I mean, you know, what is the role of religion in life? You know, it is to come to terms with the fact that we are finite people on a planet where living things die. I mean, that seems, you know, kind of bottom line.
Yeah.
So when we don't, and we, you know, we don't do it because people don't come. But if we can infuse it or create another space for it, or do it in a different way, because when people, I mean, you know, Kaddish, which Aviva knows so well, you know, when you've washed a body and you see a body and you recognize that death is in the world and that it'll happen to you, you know, it really changes your sense of yourself. I mean, I feel, okay, I'll get radical feminist here. You know, I feel that so much of our culture is about creating these things that don't change. You know, it's the basic lie of Western culture, is that things don't change. Certainly not a Jewish teaching. You know, I mean, that thing that I said about Sukkot, you know, we live in fragile huts. We are ivri going across a desert. I mean, I'll just say it, you know. I mean, it's not what I plan to talk about, but, you know, we have all these different names. We are God wrestlers. We are Jews, you know, people who praise God. But what does it mean to be an Ivri? I mean, all of these things, you know, the Hopi Indians and several Indian tribes, their name means the people. And I think Ivri is not necessarily about our being a specific tribe. I think it's a statement. I think all of these things are statements about the human condition. And Ivri is about the fact that, we go through life, and we really would like to be able to be good people, and we would really like to walk the path. And I learned from Reb Zalman Schachter this Hasidic exercise where you inscribe God's name on your body. Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. It really fits. You write the name of God vertically. So we go through life trying to fit into that template, but you know what? We can't do it. It's just the human condition to go from this side to the next. But built in, as sure as gravity, is teshuvah. Invented before the Garden of Eden, invented before the world. So there's this force. There's our natural proclivity to go outside the lines, but then there's this force that enables us to keep going, to return. 3 minutes?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, so I'm going to give you the Kaddish in 4 words. Fortunately, I've given you the whole thing written out, so I won't need to. I won't need to go through the whole thing. But the Kaddish. The Kabbalists talk about 4 worlds that we live in. Asiya is the world of the physical world. Yetzirah is the world of relationships. This is a cartoon of it. Berea, the intellectual world, and Atzilut is the spiritual world. So when we say Kaddish, we stand in all 4 of those worlds, and you kind of have to assess where people are. But to give them, there's a thing that says readings on Kaddish, yeah. So first, when you stand to say Kaddish, you stand in a very physical world with people around you saying Amen. And when you go, you have to kind of go to that mysterious place where healing happens. But to go there, you have to let go of a lot of stuff. So there is around you a community, and what does that community say? Amen. So when you say Amen, you're not just saying, so be it. You are holding the tether that allows people to go to the place they need to go for that healing to happen. You're saying, I'm here for you. I will stay here. Let go of your regular assumptions and allow yourself to be transformed by your grief. But first, you just stand there with people around you in the physical world. And then, abracadabra, which is, as you know, an Aramaic word that means, as I speak, I create. You go to the Kaddish as the, I used to say fiber optic connection. Now I say wireless connection between the worlds, where whatever you need to say and didn't get to say, it's what we talked about when we talked about Yom Kippur. It gets to happen on that. You get to say all the unfinished business gets said in the context of the Kaddish there. All of the things that you have to do, thinking about the relationship, what you learned from it, what you need from it, what you didn't get from it, what you wish you could have said, all of that happens while you're saying the Kaddish. And then abracadabra, people holding the 5 minutes. Ha!
Oh, well, listen, you had to make me look that way.
I'm late.
Oh, okay.
Very done right now, but you're good.
Okay. So then, the belief is that when you say Kaddish for someone, you are scrubbing their soul clean. You are healing their soul. So my belief is that if we're affecting them, then the relationship is still dynamic, and so all of the conversations can continue. So then the next world, the world of the intellectual world, where all of the existential questions begin to come. And you look at the words of the Kaddish and you would say, what? God didn't. Why would I want to praise God? God just did this terrible thing to me. So everything is shattered. Everything is shattered. I give people permission to say Kaddish really angry if they need to. And so all of the questions, just like Job railing against all of the intellectual issues that are raised by death get subsumed, is that the word I want, under the rubric of the Kaddish in this world. And then, all of a sudden, it's kind of like the end of Job. It's like it's not clear what happened, but things change. And people find some healing, but it's not a linear thing that you can really describe. It's like, I had all these questions, but somehow they don't seem relevant anymore. And then people have moved to the Kaddish in the fourth world, the Kaddish in Atzilut, in the spiritual world, where they really recognize that they've gone from the physical connection to the spiritual connection with the person who's died. So I'm not doing justice to what I have written there, because it really is a journey through the worlds, which is maintained and made safe by people saying Amen and holding the tethers. And okay, so we will finish with this. When we mourn, we strain our ears, listening for the voice of the deceased, until we hear that voice coming from our own hearts. Mourners, we yearn to continue the conversation. We search for the unsaid words and to resolve the unfinished issues. The Kaddish can take us there. Kaddish parts the curtains and forces open the space between the worlds, breaking open the crevices where the voices still come through and where all the worlds are one. For the price of our yearning, our anger, and our tears, the Kaddish will carry us beyond the edges of the world we know. It takes us to a place of wholeness, of peace, where all polarities, all binaries dissolve, where life and death, black and white, male and female, God and not God merge, become one. Adonai Echad, the words of the Shema, become the reality of the world. Kaddish ends exile. It suffuses the most profane regions with the holiness of God's name, and rests an Amen from the place it has not yet been forthcoming, the Amen we may have been listening for our entire lives. That Amen sustains the world. Thank you. So thank you.
Thank you.